Thank you guys, welcome. This session is about module development in Orchard. And that's my favorite thing to do. That's what I love about Orchard. It's really an enabling framework. For Orchard itself, it's more of a framework which hosts modules. And if you've done ASP.NET MVC development before, you start from scratch, you apply best practices and patterns. With Orchard, you get all of the richness of things that you need in almost any application for free. So you can start focusing on your business requirements. This session it's divided in 4 sections. I'll quickly walk you through developing a simple module. We'll write a unit test. We'll see how we can package and publish our module and push it to the gallery so others can benefit from what we build. And I'll show you how to use recipes. So we can use our module and other modules, turn that into a recipe, and quickly create new websites using those modules and data and types. So for this demo, we're going to build a simple module which allows us to create a widget or drop a widget onto any zone and allow us to render whatever content item we created. Sometimes we have an HTML widget which allows us to render HTML onto any zone. But sometimes you have a page or maybe a blog post or an advertisement as a content item, and you want to render it maybe on multiple pages. So you have a single content item and you want to render it on multiple places. So we're going to build a simple widget for that. The widget is called the Placeholder widget. And we're going to make it a little bit more interesting. We're also going to define a placeable part, which we can attach to a content type so that all items using that placeable part will be selectable and usable by this widget. So let's start with that. I've set up an empty module, so it has no code currently. So let's first look at the requirements for this module. So we're going to create a placeholder widget. For that, we need a placeholder part. We're going to create a placeable part. And we need a placeable part so that we can define a name for our content item. And this name is useful because we're going to create an XML helper so that we can render content items directly from our theme using a name. So that should be interesting. Yeah, so let's start with the placeable part. It's going to be stored in a database, so we're going to start with a placeable part record. So we start by creating a new folder called models. You can't see what I'm doing? Oh, please help.
It's not as easy as it looks, is it?
What's that? It's showing up. Oh, I'm showing my Visual Studio, but it's not rendering, it's not projecting.
Oh, close the slides. Close the slides.
Oh, it's...
No. Close the slides. Escape.
Yeah, escape.
And then...
Yeah, and then I switch. Perfect, thanks. Okay, so we have our models folder, which is a convention. If you want to have database entities, store them in a namespace that has models in it. So we create a new class and call this one the placeable part record. This will be our database entity for a placeable part. I created a bunch of snippets, so you don't have to watch me type the entire session. But this is a simple part. It just has a name, which is a technical name of the content item. We'll quickly create the part. which inherits from content part. That's, as Bertrand explained, content types are built out of content parts, which are sort of Lego blocks, building blocks, if you will. And that's what we create here, a placeable part, which we can attach to any content type. And this simply wraps the name property of our record class. So that's it for, let's move this to its own file quickly. So now this is more interesting. This will be the placeholder part for a placeholder widget. First, we define the record entity, database entity. And let's not forget to have it derived from content part records. Same goes for this one. The reason we're inheriting from content part record is because we get a virtual ID and a reference to our content item record. So that's only required for content part records. So our placeholder part record will have two properties. Target content item ID will be the ID of the content item that we want to render in place. And the display type will be the display type to render that content item. So that's our database entity. Let's create a placeholder part. Let's move this over to its own file. Okay, so this is a little bit more interesting even. We're implementing a lazy field, which allows us to lazily load in the content item we want to render. And this lazy field will be set up using a handler, which we'll see in a minute. So now we have our models in place. The next thing we need to do is we need to tell Orchard where to store these database entities, or at least in which tables. So for that, we are using migrations. So let's create a new class. Let's call it migrations. Migrations need to implement data migration impl. Let's import some namespaces. So this is a bit more code. I'll walk you through it quickly. First, we start by creating the table for the placeholder part record. We'll create a table for the placeholder part record. As you can see, we're using content part record, which basically just creates the identity column. For our table. Same goes for placeholder part record. And here we start defining our placeable part. So that's an actual content part. It's attachable, so we can attach it to any content type we want. We define the placeholder part, which we will use for placeholder widget. First, so here we define our placeholder widget, which is basically, it's a content type with a couple of parts, including our placeholder part. That's how you create a specific widget, by creating your specific content parts and implement logic specific to your widget. And of course, we need to set the stereotype setting to a widget. And here we go ahead and define a new content type called placeable page. And that will be it's just for this demo, so that we could attach the placeable part to any content type. For now, we'll just attach it to this new type, which is like a page, but this one will be placeable. Okay. So now we have our migrations in place. The next step would be implementing the content part drivers. Because a content part in its own usually doesn't do much. For the widget, for example, we want to be able to render it on the front end, but we also want to be able to configure the properties of that widget in the back end. And for that, we implement drivers. And a driver is sort of like a controller, but specific to drive content parts. So we go ahead and create a drivers folder. And let's start with the simplest of them, and that's the placeable part driver. And drivers need to derive from content part driver for the placeable parts. So here we're overriding the prefix property, which is a good practice, not required, but sometimes, yeah, you could have a content type with multiple parts which use the same fields accidentally. That's where the prefix comes in to distinguish between them. So it's a good practice to override that one. Otherwise, it would be an empty string. In this case, this placeable part, it has a single property. We'll create a simple shape, an editor shape called parts placeable edit. We'll implement a view in a minute. The second overload for the editor, it's basically the post-back version. So when the user hits save, we need to update our part with the posted data. And we're simply using the try-update model for updater, which is an iUpdate model. But if you run the debugger, you'll see it's the controller, the content controller. We're also implementing exporting and importing. So if you want to participate in import-export functionality of word chart, you better implement these methods. It's simple and very useful, especially when you work with recipes, quickly regenerating your website from scratch. Then this is very useful. So that's it for the placeable part driver. Let's continue with placeholder part driver. Okay, so this one has a little bit more code. This one has a display method. The other one didn't need a display method because we don't want to display a placeable content item. That's the responsibility of the parts attached to that content type. But this display shape will render the actual target content item, which we'll be able to select from the editor, which we implement here. We basically what we're doing here is returning a shape, which we do here at the end. But we want to present the user with a list of available content items to render. So for that, we create a placeholder part view model, which will hold not only the selected content item and specified display type, but also a list of available content items. So in this case, we use a view model. As you can see, it has a target content item ID, which matches the target content item ID of the part, including the display type. And here we have a list of placeable content items. Let's move this to its own file. And to a view models folder. That's what I really like about module development. All the practices and patterns, they're all well defined. It's just, for the most part, it's really following those patterns. It makes it easy to quickly get acquainted with other modules. Okay, so here we set up our placeholder view model. If we did specify an updater, then that means it's a postback, so we update our view model. And here we're using a content manager to get the actual content item being selected and then assign it to the target content item, which is, if you see, it's a property that uses the lazy fields value. Again, we'll get to that implementation in a minute. Yeah, and here we are loading, using the content manager, we're loading a list of placeable part items. So it returns a list of content items which have the placeable part attached. So that's the content manager in action again. And the content manager we injected here in the constructor. Okay, so now that we have our drivers in place, we need to let Orchard know how to persist and load our database entities. And for that, we use the storage filter, there's a filters property on each content handler where we need to add it to. So we create a handlers folder. And let's start again with the placeable handler. Let's rename this to placeable part handler to be consistent. Content handlers really allow you to handle various events related to content items, such as displaying. There's actually a content handler which implements the driver mechanism used in Orchard. And all we're doing here is we're injecting a repository of placeable part records, which is our database entity for placeable parts. And we're creating a storage filter for that repository and adding it to the filters. Sometimes you can forget it. If you forget this, then you probably get an exception that your record is null. That hints you that you forgot to add a repository. Let's create another one for the placeholder part. Again, here we're injecting a repository, this time for the placeholder part record. But we're also injecting a content manager, which we use here to set up the lazy field, target content item field of our placeholder part. And it has two methods, a loader, as you can see here, and a setter. And we're using the content manager again to, based off the selected content, the target content item ID, to actually load that content items, because we need that to display, which we'll see in a second. And when we set it, we just need to store the ID of that content item. That's the setter here. Okay. Yeah, so now let's create the views. Let's start with the editor views. Views. And edit templates need to live in the edited templates folder. Create a subfolder called parts. And we'll start with creating the editor for the placeable part, which is the simplest one, because it has just a name property. Placeable part. So here we simply have a label, a text box for the name, and a hint stating to the user that this is the technical name of the content item. We'll create another one for the actual placeholder widget. And this is a little bit more interesting because we have a list of placeable content items in our view model. So we're projecting that to a list of select list items so that we can use that for the drop-down list for HTML Helper method. And we render this display type as a text box. So almost done. One final step is to specify where the editor shapes are rendered. And I'm forgetting another important one. That's the actual display of the placeholder widget. So let's not forget about that. So this will be rendered on the front end. So this is a really simple view. All we're doing here is grabbing the selected target content item and feeding it to the build display method that's new, I think, in 1.7. Yes. And basically, you can't directly render a content item. The only thing that Orchard knows how to render are shapes. So we need to render that internally it's using the content manager to render that content item into a tree of shapes. And that's what we're doing here. We're invoking build display, which will return a shape, and that's what we display using the display method. And we're specifying the target content item, and we're specifying the specified display type, but if none has been specified, we just render it using a summary display type, which is the same display type being used when you render a list of content items. And finally, we need to create a placement.info file because that's how the driver mechanism knows where to actually place the shapes, of, like the editor shapes and the display shapes. And its placement is, it's a nice mechanism. It's a simple XML format. And it looks like this. So we're configuring the 3 parts, the 2 editor parts, the editor shapes, and the placeholder shape for the placeholder part. So let's see if that works. Okay, so let me first enable my custom theme, because we're going to make small change in a minute. This is based off the theme machine, but I don't want to mess in the original themes, so it's better to either create a clone of it, a copy of it, and then mess with that. Okay, so let's go to modules and enable our feature, which is called Placeholder. Perfect. So as you can see, our migration was executed when we enabled our feature. So as you recall, we defined a placeable content type, placeable page. So let's create one of that. What you see here is the technical name of the placeable part. So it's being rendered here as specified by placement.info. It's being inserted at the top. Let's call this one advertisement. Obviously, it will be awesome. Okay, so it's like a page, with the difference that we are using the placeable part. So now what we can do is render this page as is, but we can also use a widget or placeholder widget to render this anywhere we want on, for example, the home page. So let's go to widgets, and let's add this. Let's add a new widget to the aside second zone. Placeholder widget. It's an advertisement. And here, this is our drop-down list we just created a view for. And it's rendering the only content item which has the placeholder part, advertisement. And let's leave this empty for now. Let's check it out. And there you go. Now we have a widget which we can use to render any content type, not just placeholder page or placeable page. We could, for example, render a blog post. Let me show you that quickly. Let's start by attaching that placeable part to the blog post type. I will quickly create a new blog called blog. And a new post. And this will be our post of the day. Okay. Now, let's say we want to render the blog post of the day as a widget in the before or maybe after content zone. We choose our placeholder widget and choose post of the day. And this time, let's not use the summary, the default display type summary, but the detail, just to see that it works. There you go. So that's could be useful. Sometimes you may face a requirement that you want to render a specific configurable content item that's editable by the user, but you don't want the user to be able to you don't want to use a widget for that. You just want to render that content item straight from your view. And for that, it could be nice to have a HTML helper. So that's really simple. Let's see how that looks. So we'll just create a new folder called helpers. And a class called Placeholder HTML Helper, or something similar. Okay, so an HTML helper, it's an extension method for the HTML helper class. And what we want to be able to specify the technical name of the content item to be rendered and the display type. So that's how this signature looks like. We accept a name and a display type. And what's interesting is that even though it's a static method, we can still, via HTML helper, access the current context. And when we have access to the context, we can get the work context, which allows us to resolve any dependency we need. In this case, we need the content manager and a custom service called iPlaceholder service. Let's quickly stub that out. Which will help us getting content by name. And of course, when we create a custom service class, we need to be able to have it registered with AutoFac, the IOC container. The way to do that, or one way to do that, is by having it derived from iDependency, which is just a marker class, really. And again, we're leveraging the content manager to retrieve the content item by name instead of by ID. And we're using the query methods, using placeable part and placeable part records, so that we can use the where clause and make a selection by name. And we just take the first or default in case there are multiple content items with the same name. And we need to inject this one to the constructor. Okay, so the class needs to be static, of course. Let's build. And let's try it out. That's why I created the custom theme. So let's try and render this advertisement content item using the XML helper from the layout. And let's create a shape for that. So let's create a advertisement shape and add it to, I don't know, a site second or a site first. So here we're creating an ad hoc shape at position 0. And we have a shape now, but we need a view file to render that shape. Otherwise, we'll get an error and see nothing interesting. So shapes and views, they use the same name. There's an advanced technique called alternates, so that you can vary on different requirements which viewer you want to use to render. But by default, it will use the view name which has the same name as the shape. And that's a typo. Oh, that's useful. Okay, yeah, so we have HTML, and what did we call it? Display content. So let's say we have a display content helper. The name of that content item was advertisement. And let's render it using the detailed display type and see what happens. Always exciting waiting to see if it works. And it works. So now we have a useful HTML helper, a widget. This is interesting to show how to work with the content manager, but as of 1.6, we have the content item picker field. So you don't have to create that drop-down list yourself, you could, which is kind of limiting. Instead, you could create a similar widget using the content item picker field, so that provides a more nicer way to pick content items to render. So that's a short introduction to module development in Orchard. We're using Orchard-specific things, but an Orchard module, it's really like an MVC area. You could create controllers, build entire applications with it, and integrate into the Orchard API and system as you need it. When you develop modules, some like to create tests first and then build out the application. Others prefer to write the unit test after the fact. In this case, we'll write the unit test after the fact. We don't have a lot of difficult or complex logic, but it's interesting to see how to set up a test nonetheless. So let's see how that works. Yeah, you want to break now? Okay, so let's have a break first and continue with it after the break. Thank you.